So you've sort of put out the idea of why don't we just get rid of them entirely? So just help me understand a little bit in your mind what that could look like. Is that just having the market set interest rates? And when you talk about independent currencies, can you give an example of what some of those might be? I mean, obviously, gold comes to mind, cryptocurrencies come to mind. Are there other types of models you'd like to see out there as well?
Well, I mean, ultimately, you need to have some tokens. Somewhere there's got to be some tokens in an economy. You've got to have some tokens that people can either use to transact with or use to save. I use not to transact with. But you do need to have. You need a number of tokens, and that's kind of all that money is really. And where there haven't been tokens, in a particular group or community, what you found is that group or community has found some tokens to use, right? So I suppose in prison camps it was cigarettes, right? They start to use cigarettes. Cigarettes become the token, right? But you need to have some kind of fixed number of tokens, right? And that's ultimately the thing that backs the whole system. So it doesn't need to be gold or selling cryptocurrency or anything like that. The advantage with gold or cryptocurrency is that they're kind of naturally finite, right? Or very, very inelastic. Right, there's no reason theoretically why the government couldn't just, you can just use dollars, which is what they do effectively in the crypto ecosystem with stable coins, right? There's no reason why you couldn't have a government that just issue the tokens. The problem is that there's no constraint on the government issuing tokens, and then you're back to square one. Well, what's the point then, right? So I think that theoretical, and this is all very theoretical, right? Because it's not going to happen, right? Just to be very clear, and I think this is even close to happening. But as a kind of hypothetical exercise, I think it's kind of interesting to think about. But you've basically, the way free banking used to work is the tokens would basically be driven by the stock of gold, right? And the economy. Now, anyone could set up a bank and take deposits. Right, and if you put a deposit with Bank of Grice, I'll give you a ticket, right, that says I've got like 10 ounces of gold held at Bank of Grice, right, and you might kind of give that to John, right, in exchange for some goods, and then he might give, and then suddenly that ticket becomes currency, right, because frankly carrying gold around is actually quite kind of lumpy, right, but suppose I actually realize, well, this is actually quite neat because Adam doesn't really want his gold back, right? He's quite happy with this. So I can actually just issue someone else, a token for 10 ounces of gold, and someone else, even though, in other words, you get a fractional reserve banking system, right? And a lot of economists, and crypto people and Austrian economists rail against fractional reserve. I actually feel kind of relaxed about it. But the way to keep and the reason for that is because the system can keep itself in check. If there are other banks who are also issuing paper IOUs based on the gold that they hold in their vaults, based on their reserves, right? So if you've got a whole bunch of different banks all issuing paper, and everyone, which is ultimately backed by the reserves, gold or whatever, then you've not got a central bank. You've just got a whole bunch of different banks' papers. So each bank can be an issuing bank. It can issue currency. There's no restrictions, right? Simple as that. Now, what keeps the system clean? What stops me from just infinitely issuing as many pieces of paper as I want? Well, I would issue those pieces of paper as a loan. So suppose you just come to me and say, listen, I want a loan. I don't have any gold, right? And I say, well, here's a loan for 10 ounces of gold. Right? You can give me 10% next year, right? You go and then spend that. And ultimately, it will find its way through the banking system into one of my rival banks who will present it to me to clear an exchange. They want the gold for that. So if I overissue currency, then effectively I'm running out of gold very, very quickly. It's a very dangerous position that I've just put myself in. So there's a natural, and by the way, if I'm expanding my balance sheet, the other banks will make sure that they present my notes to me during the clearing process, because they'll be worried about my creditworthiness. Because they say, hang on, Bank of Grice has gone a bit nuts. Have you seen how many bloody loans he's issuing? Right, we better, let's make sure we get our gold back as soon as we can. So that's actually what keeps the system in check, right? There's no central authority that keeps the system in check, that keeps the supply of money stable, that keeps the price level probably negative, right? You would probably get price deflation in this kind of environment. I think that you wouldn't get anything like the kind of exaggerated booms and busts that you get with centralized reserve expansion and contraction, right? Because the system keeps its own reserves in check according to the needs of the economy.
Yeah, so huge fan of that. And, again, this is an intellectual exercise. It seems like you'd probably go through some creative destruction process in the initial transition where the bad players blow up, get forced out of the system by the better players. But over time, it's the trustworthy, effective, efficient players that sustain. I mean, Dylan, I could talk to you about this all day. It's such a cool thought process. And maybe just as we hop off it, see if I can get a quick answer from you on, so what's standing in front of that? Is it just the power structure? There's just so many people, so many powerful people, institutions that benefit so mightily from the current system that it's not going to get pulled from their hands?
I mean, that's very quick. That's also such a great question. I think that, like Bagehot, Walter Bagehot, who wrote Lombard Street, and he was the kind of founding editor of The Economist magazine, and anyone who's studied economics, or certainly economic history, financial history, is aware of Bagehot, because Bagehot almost wrote the central bank playbook. And he said that during times of crisis, the central bank should lend freely at high interest rates, right? And that's almost become central bank doctrine, or they've forgotten high interest rate stuff now, right? It's just about lending freely, right? But the thing about Lombard Street, the thing about Bagehot's book, he actually said that this was a regrettable circumstance, because the idea that you would have a centralization of reserves, in the central bank, was just crazy, and it was clearly unstable, and it would be far better to have bank reserves widely distributed throughout the system. But he said the problem is, just because it's not rational, just because it's not actually a rational system, doesn't mean you can change it any more than you can change the monarchy. Having the monarchy is not a particularly rational system in the UK. It serves no real function, but it's just there because it's always been there, and it probably always will. There's no real impetus to change it. People don't really understand what the need is to change it. And I feel that Bagehot was onto something in terms of the current kind of monetary system. By the way, there is also, I think that economists, the more I think about economics and macroeconomics, the more I actually think that it should really be the study of power. It shouldn't really be the study of just, the economic part of society. I think it's to do with the decision-making, the collective decision-making, and that is the study of power. And power doesn't really have any natural checks on it. And power, people who like power and people who are attracted by power, by their very nature, are very unlikely to relinquish power. So the idea that politicians would actually say, you're right, this is a much better banking system, let's redesign it this way, because of course you go back to where we started. A free banking system would never fund a war, right? You're basically stuck with taxation, right? Which is why I think it's a good thing, because it's a check on government power. But that's the very reason why I think that government is never going to be the instigator of this type of reform. And if you look at what's happening in cryptocurrencies now with the regulation of stable coins, I think you're just seeing exactly the same thing playing out. It's actually about power. It's not about consumer protection. It's purely about power, and the need to continue and to deepen financial surveillance, in my opinion.
All right. Understandable, but sad. It's an old story. Power controls, the John Kenneth Galbraith, that those that are, I'm going to murder the quote here, but something like, those that have power will risk losing it all to avoid having to give up even a small slice of it.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating thing. I think the study of power increasingly, that's I mean, power has its own logic. And I think this is where a lot of economics, you know, including the discussion we've just been having for the last 15 minutes, you know, a lot of economic logic just falls by the wayside because people don't understand the logic of power, which has its own mathematics and its own dynamic. I remember Michael Lewis wrote about, during the Greek crisis, he wrote about the Greek government, and he said, you know, the Greek government wasn't just corrupt, it was corrupting. Anyone who touched it was effectively tainted by this. And I think that's, you know, I think that's just a really insightful, typical Michael Lewis, really, really kind of insightful statement. And, you know, when you look around, that's what you see. It's not that the kind of power structures are, and I'm sounding like I'm ranting here, and I don't mean to, and I kind of, you know, I think my days of kind of railing against it, and I'm not that interested. I'm just very kind of interested as a phenomenon in itself. You know, it's a very interesting kind of yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon to me.